The conference room felt like a cathedral built for mourning. All dark wood and leather chairs that creaked under the weight of grief we weren't allowed to show. Rain drummed against the windows of Matthews and Associates, blurring the Boston skyline into watercolor streaks of gray and gold. I sat alone on one side of the table, my black dress still smelling faintly of the funeral flowers from 3 days ago, while across from me, Patricia adjusted her pearls with the precision of someone checking ammunition. Marcus scrolled through his phone, jaw tight, already calculating. Lauren dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief that had never seen tears. They looked like a family. I looked like the mistake my father had finally corrected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jonathan Matthews entered with a leather folder. His expression carefully neutral in that way lawyers practice until it becomes a second face. He was older than I expected, silver hair combed back, eyes that had seen too many families destroy themselves over money to be surprised by anything anymore. He sat down slowly, opened the folder and cleared his throat. The sound cut through the room like a blade through silk. He told us he would be reading the last will and testament of Thomas Richard Bennett. His voice was steady, almost soothing, the kind of tone you use when delivering bad news to children. Patricia leaned forward. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. Lauren stopped pretending to cry. And I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, waiting for the words that would make official what I'd always known. I was never really part of this family. I was just the girl my father married into when he took Patricia as his second wife. The first 15 minutes were exactly what I expected. The Beacon Hill mansion went to Patricia. The summer home in Newport, also Patricia. Marcus received controlling interest in Bennett Maritime Holdings, the shipping empire my father had spent 40 years building into something that moved cargo across 3 continents. Lauren got the investment portfolios, the art collection, the vintage car collection my father had loved more than he'd ever loved me. Jonathan read each bequest in the same measured tone, and with each one, I felt myself shrinking, disappearing, becoming the ghost I'd always been in that house. Then he paused. He looked down at the document, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe. Or concern. He adjusted his glasses and read the final paragraph. To my daughter Victoria Bennett, I leave the sum of $50,000 in my personal library. May she find in books what I failed to give her in life. The room was silent except for the rain. $50,000. My father's estate was worth $340 million, and he'd left me the cost of a decent car and some dusty first editions I'd never wanted. Patricia smiled, a small curve of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. Marcus exhaled, shoulders relaxing. Lauren finally put away the handkerchief, her performance no longer necessary. I didn't cry. I'd used up all my tears years ago, back when I still believed my father might see me as more than an obligation inherited through marriage vows. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and walked toward the door. Jonathan called my name, but I didn't stop. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. Surrounded by people celebrating my erasure, I made it to the hallway before my legs gave out. I leaned against the wall, marble cold against my palms, and stared at the oil painting across from me. Some Bennett ancestor from the 1800s, stern and unsmiling, judging me for my weakness. The building was old money and old ghosts, the kind of place where your worth was measured in your last name and your ability to pretend everything was fine. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. We need to discuss the logistics of clearing out your things from the house. Please coordinate with Patricia's assistant. He didn't even have the decency to pretend it hurt him. To him, I was already gone, just another item to be cleared out and forgotten. I walked out into the rain without an umbrella. Boston in October is all cold wind and wet leaves, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and stays there. I stood on the steps of the law office watching cars splash through puddles, their headlights cutting through the early evening gloom. Somewhere across the city, Patricia was probably already redecorating, erasing the last traces of my father's first marriage, the first family, the life before she arrived and made everything hers. My father had been gone for 6 months, but I'd lost him long before that. Cancer took his body, but Patricia had taken his heart years earlier, along with his attention, his pride, his legacy. She'd done it slowly, carefully, the way water wears down stone. A comment here about how I was too sensitive, too academic, too much like my mother. A suggestion there that perhaps I'd be happier pursuing my own path, away from the family business. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd already been pushed so far to the margins that I was barely visible. I walked to my car, a 10-year-old sedan that looked embarrassingly out of place in the parking garage next to Marcus's Tesla and Lauren's Range Rover. Inside, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. 41 years old, hair going gray at the temples, eyes that looked older than they should. I'd spent my entire adult life studying marine ecosystems, earning a doctorate, publishing research that actually mattered. I'd built a life that had nothing to do with Bennett Maritime Holdings or shipping routes or the weight of family expectations. And still, sitting in that garage, I felt like a failure because my father had valued me at $50,000 in some books. My phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but the name on the screen stopped me. George Palmer. My father's assistant for 23 years, the man who'd scheduled every meeting, screened every call, knew every secret my father had ever kept. I answered, my voice rough. He asked if I'd left the law office yet. I told him I was still in the garage. He said he needed to see me, that it was urgent, that there was something about the will I needed to know. His voice was tight, anxious in a way I'd never heard from George. He was always calm, always composed, the steady presence in my father's chaotic empire. But now he sounded afraid. We met at a coffee shop in Cambridge, far enough from Beacon Hill that we wouldn't run into anyone from my father's world. George arrived 10 minutes after me, looking older than I remembered, his suit rumpled, his eyes rimmed with red. He ordered nothing, just sat across from me in a corner booth and pulled out a manila envelope, worn at the edges like it had been carried around for months. He told me he'd been my father's assistant since before I was born, that he'd watched me grow up, watched my father make choices that broke his own heart. He said Patricia had been a poison that seeped in slowly, turning my father against his own instincts, his own values. But in the end, George said, Thomas had remembered who he really was. He'd remembered Catherine, my mother, the woman he'd loved before ambition and loneliness had driven him into Patricia's arms. I stopped him. I told him my mother had been dead for 35 years, that she drowned off the coast of Maine when I was 6, that I barely remembered her face except from photographs. George shook his head slowly, his hands trembling as he pushed the envelope across the table. He said there were things I didn't know, things my father had kept hidden to protect me, to protect everyone. And now that he was gone, the truth was the only inheritance that mattered. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in my father's handwriting, the script shaky but unmistakable. It was dated 1 week before he died, when the cancer had already spread to his brain, when the morphine made him drift between clarity and confusion. The letter was addressed to me. Victoria, it began. If you're reading this, then George has done what I asked. I don't have much time left, and there are things you need to know before Patricia destroys what remains of the truth. The will that Jonathan read today is not my final will. It's the one Patricia forced me to sign when I was too weak to fight, when the pain made me willing to agree to anything just to make it stop. But I made another will, my real will, and I hid it where only someone who truly knew me would think to look. My hands shook. The coffee shop noise faded into static. I kept reading. Your mother didn't drown, Victoria. That's what I told everyone, what I had to tell everyone, because the truth would have destroyed us all. Catherine found something she wasn't supposed to find. Documents that proved Patricia and Marcus were embezzling from the company, funneling money into offshore accounts, preparing to push me out and take everything. Catherine confronted me, begged me to go to the authorities, but I was a coward. I was afraid of the scandal, afraid of losing the business my grandfather built. So I made a deal with Patricia. Catherine would disappear, go into hiding, and in exchange, Patricia would stop the embezzling and never touch you. I sent your mother away to protect her, and I told you she died to protect you from the truth. It's the worst thing I've ever done, and I've spent 35 years trying to live with it. The letter blurred. I blinked hard, forcing myself to keep reading. The second will is hidden in the lighthouse at Harborview, the one I bought 30 years ago, the one I never sold even though Patricia wanted me to. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's in the lamp room, behind the fourth panel from the east window. In that will, I've left everything to you. The house, the company, the investments, everything. Patricia and Marcus and Lauren get nothing, because they've already taken enough. I know this will seem impossible, I know you'll doubt everything, but George will help you. He has documents, proof of what Patricia has done, proof that the will Jonathan Reed was signed under duress. Fight for this, Victoria. Fight for yourself, for your mother, for the life I stole from both of you. The combination to open the panel is your mother's birthday. You'll remember. I made sure you would. The letter was signed simply Dad. Not Father, not Thomas, just Dad. The name I'd stopped using when I was 12, when I realized he'd chosen his new family over me. George was watching me, waiting. I looked up at him, my throat tight, and asked if he knew what was in the letter. He nodded slowly and said he'd helped my father write it, that he'd been there the night Thomas had hidden the second will, that he'd witnessed the signature and notarized it himself. He said Patricia had manipulated the first will by bringing in doctors who would testify that my father wasn't mentally competent, by convincing him that if he didn't sign, she'd contest everything and drag the family through years of legal battles. Thomas had been dying, exhausted, and he'd signed just to have peace. But 3 days later, when the morphine cleared enough for him to think straight, he'd called George to his bedside and dictated the real will. I asked George why he hadn't said something during the reading, why he'd let Jonathan present the false will as if it were legitimate. George looked down at his hands, weathered and spotted with age, and said he'd been afraid. Patricia had made threats, subtle but clear. If George interfered, if he tried to present the second will, she'd make sure he was charged as an accomplice to my father's supposed mental incompetence. She'd destroy his reputation, his retirement, everything he'd worked for. But sitting in that coffee shop watching me read the letter, George said he couldn't stay silent anymore. He said my father had been his friend, the best man he'd ever known despite his mistakes, and he owed him this final act of loyalty. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just learned. My mother was alive. Patricia had been embezzling. There was a second will. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my father's death, was built on lies that were finally crumbling. I asked George where my mother was now, if he knew, if my father had stayed in contact with her. George hesitated, then said that Thomas had sent money every month to an account in Portland, Maine, but he'd never told George who received it or how to find her. The payments had stopped when Thomas died, the account closed by whoever had been managing it. But George believed that if I found the second will, if I claimed my inheritance, my mother would hear about it. She'd been watching from a distance all these years, waiting for the moment when it was safe to come back. The rain had stopped by the time I left the coffee shop, but the streets were still slick and shining under the streetlights. I drove home to my small apartment in Somerville, a place Patricia had once visited and described as quaint, which was her way of saying inadequate. It was a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and radiators that clanged through the night, but it was mine. The walls were covered with photographs of coral reefs and kelp forests, the work I'd done in graduate school studying ecosystem collapse. My father had never asked about my research, never attended a single lecture or conference. To him, my career was a hobby, something to keep me occupied until I grew out of it and joined the family business like I was supposed to. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter again, and then again, memorizing every word. The lighthouse at Harborview. I knew the place. My father had taken me there twice when I was a child, before my mother disappeared, before everything fell apart. It was a small coastal town in Maine, the kind of place where tourists came in summer and locals hunkered down in winter. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in the 1980s, turned into a private residence, and my father had bought it on a whim. At least that's what he'd told everyone. Now I understood. He'd bought it as a hiding place, a monument to his guilt, a place where he could keep the truth locked away from Patricia's reach. I opened my laptop and searched for Harborview, Maine. The town had a population of about 2,000, most of them fishermen or artists who'd fled the city for something quieter. The lighthouse sat on a rocky point at the edge of town, accessible by a narrow road that wound along the cliffs. According to property records, it was still owned by the Bennett Family Trust, which meant Patricia couldn't sell it without going through probate, which meant I still had time. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face from old photographs, trying to imagine what she looked like now, if she'd aged the way I had, if she'd ever thought about coming back. I thought about my father, dying in that mansion, surrounded by people who were counting his money before his heart stopped beating, knowing he'd sent his wife away and lied to his daughter for 35 years. I thought about Patricia, sleeping in my mother's bed, wearing my mother's jewelry, living the life that should have been someone else's. By dawn I'd made my decision. I would drive to Harborview, find the second will, and bring it back to Boston. I would fight Patricia and Marcus and Lauren with every legal weapon I could find. And I would find my mother, wherever she was hiding, and tell her that it was finally safe to come home. I called in sick to work, threw some clothes into a bag and started driving north. The highway stretched out gray and endless, lined with trees just starting to turn orange and red. I drove past Portland, past the exit for my father's summer office, past the turnoff for the beach where my mother had supposedly drowned. The landscape grew wilder, rockier, the ocean appearing and disappearing between hills covered in pine and birch. Harborview appeared suddenly, a cluster of white buildings huddled against the coast like they were trying to keep warm. The main street had a general store, a post office, a diner with a faded sign advertising lobster rolls. I drove slowly through town, feeling eyes on me from windows and porches, the way small towns always watch strangers. At the end of a winding coastal road, past houses that grew farther apart and more weathered, the lighthouse rose against the sky. It was taller than I remembered, white paint peeling, the lamp room dark and empty. The keeper's cottage attached to the base looked abandoned, shutters hanging crooked, grass growing wild around the foundation. I parked and got out, the wind immediately cutting through my jacket, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed and something older, like stone that had been standing against storms for 100 years. The door was locked, but George had given me a key, old brass worn smooth from decades of use. It turned with a grind of rust, and the door swung inward, revealing a dim interior that smelled of mildew and dust. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. The same wooden staircase spiraling up, the same narrow windows letting in slices of gray light, the same sense of isolation, like the world outside didn't quite exist here. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The walls were covered with old photographs, images of the lighthouse in its working days, keeper standing proudly beside the lamp, ships passing safely in the night. At the top, the lamp room opened up, all windows and iron framework, the massive Fresnel lens still in place though dark and dusty. The ocean spread out below, restless and gray, waves breaking white against the rocks. I counted the panels from the east window. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth panel looked identical to the others, but when I pressed on it, I felt something give. I tried to slide it, to lift it, to pull it, nothing worked. Then I remembered the combination, my mother's birthday. June 14th, 1952. 6/14/52. But there was no keypad, no obvious lock. I ran my hands along the edges of the panel, and my fingers found small indentations, barely visible. 6 of them arranged vertically. I pressed them in sequence 6, 1, 4, 5, 2. Something clicked deep inside the wall. The panel swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a space about 2 feet deep. Inside was a metal box, the kind you'd use for important documents, fireproof and waterproof. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected, substantial, real. I set it on the floor and opened the clasp. Inside, on top of everything else, was another envelope with my name on it. Below that, a thick document bound in blue legal backing. Last Will and Testament of Thomas Richard Bennett. Dated 7 days before his death. Witnessed and notarized by George Palmer. I sat there on the floor of the lamp room, holding my inheritance in my hands, and finally let myself cry. Not the bitter tears of the will reading, but something deeper. Something that came from a place I'd kept locked away for 35 years. My father had remembered me. In the end, when it mattered most, he'd chosen me over Patricia's threats and Marcus's ambitions and his own fear of scandal. He'd hidden the truth where only I could find it, in a lighthouse that held the last memories of my mother, secured by the date of her birth. The wind howled around the lamp room, rattling the windows, and somewhere far below, the ocean crashed against rocks that had stood for millennia. I opened the will and began to read. My father's final words to a daughter he'd failed to protect but never stopped loving. I read the will 3 times before I could fully process what it said. Every asset, every property, every share of Bennett Maritime Holdings was left to me. The Beacon Hill Mansion, the Newport Summer House, the company my great-grandfather had founded in 1873, all of it mine. Patricia received nothing. Marcus received nothing. Lauren received nothing. The document was clinical in its precision, listing properties and account numbers and legal descriptions with the detached efficiency of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. But at the end, in a section labeled Personal Statement, my father's voice came through clear and raw. He wrote that he had lived as a coward for 35 years, that he had chosen comfort over courage, that he had let Patricia poison his judgment and corrupt his values because it was easier than fighting. He wrote that Marcus had been embezzling since the day he turned 25, that Lauren had forged his signature on loan documents, that together they had siphoned millions from the company while he looked the other way because confronting them would mean admitting he'd married a criminal. He wrote that the only honest thing he'd done in decades was protect me by keeping me far from their influence, even though it meant I grew up thinking he didn't love me. The protection had looked like rejection, and he knew I'd spent my whole life trying to understand why I wasn't enough. But I was enough, he wrote. I was the only one who'd ever been enough. I'd built a life on my own terms, free from the corruption that had rotted his family from the inside. He was proud of me in ways he'd never learned to express, proud that I'd become someone who studied the natural world instead of exploiting it, someone who asked questions instead of demanding answers, someone who looked like Catherine and carried her goodness in ways that had terrified him because it reminded him of everything he'd destroyed. The letter ended with an apology and a request. He was sorry for the childhood I'd endured, for the loneliness, for the feeling that I had to earn love through perfection when love should have been given freely. And he asked that when I found my mother, when I brought her home, I would tell her that he'd never stopped loving her, that sending her away had broken something in him that never healed, that if he could do it over, he would have fought Patricia and taken his chances with scandal and prosecution because nothing they could have taken from him would have hurt as much as losing Catherine. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the metal box along with the will. The lamp room had grown colder as afternoon faded toward evening, the light through the windows turning amber and long. I could hear the ocean more clearly now, rhythmic and patient, the sound of something that had been here long before the lighthouse and would remain long after it crumbled. I sat with my back against the wall and stared at the Fresnel lens, imagining it blazing to life, warning ships away from the rocks, saving lives through simple persistence. My phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. A text from Patricia. We need to discuss the timeline for vacating the premises. The house must be cleared by month's end. She didn't even pretend to be sympathetic, didn't cushion the eviction with false kindness. To her, I was already gone, just furniture to be removed. I thought about texting back, about telling her I had the real will, that her carefully constructed empire was about to collapse. But something stopped me. George's face in the coffee shop, the fear in his voice. Patricia had threatened him, which meant she was capable of more than just manipulation. She was dangerous when cornered. I needed help. Someone who understood the law and couldn't be bought or intimidated. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a name I hadn't called in 3 years. Jennifer Okafor. We'd been roommates in graduate school, both of us studying marine biology, both of us planning careers in research. But Jennifer had switched paths after her father died intestate, leaving his construction company tangled in legal disputes that took 5 years to resolve. She'd gone to law school, specialized in estate litigation, and now ran her own firm in Portland focusing on cases where families weaponized inheritance against each other. I'd gone to her father's funeral, and she'd told me then that if I ever needed help with my own complicated family, she'd be there. I called her. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm with surprise. She said my name like a question, like she was checking to make sure it was really me and not some ghost from our shared past. I told her I was in Maine, that I'd found a second will, that my father's family had cut me out of everything but I had proof they'd been lying. There was a long pause and then Jennifer's voice shifted, becoming sharper, more focused. She said she could meet me in Portland tomorrow morning, that I shouldn't tell anyone else about the will until we'd verified its authenticity and built a legal strategy. She asked if I was safe, if anyone knew where I was. I looked around the empty lamp room, wind whistling through gaps in the window frames, and said I was alone. Jennifer told me to stay that way. I spent the night in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, in a bedroom that still had furniture covered in dusty sheets. The bed was old but sturdy, the mattress surprisingly comfortable once I'd shaken off the decades of neglect. I lay in the dark listening to the building settle, to the ocean's constant conversation with the rocks, to the wind testing every weakness in the structure. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of my mother standing on the shore, calling my name but never turning around so I could see her face. Morning arrived gray and cold, fog rolling in from the ocean so thick I could barely see my car from the cottage door. I locked everything carefully, tucking the metal box into my overnight bag, and drove back through Harborview. The town looked different in daylight, less lonely and more defiant, like a place that had survived by refusing to surrender to the elements. I stopped at the diner for coffee and overheard two fishermen talking about the lighthouse, how Old Man Bennett had bought it decades ago but never did anything with it, how it just sat there like a monument to money that didn't know what to do with itself. I wanted to tell them it wasn't a monument to money, it was a vault for secrets, but I just paid for my coffee and left. Portland was an hour south, the fog lifting as I drove, revealing a coastline that shifted between rocky drama and quiet beaches. I'd been to the city before for conferences, knew its streets well enough to find Jennifer's office without GPS. She worked out of a renovated brick building in the Old Port District, her firm's name etched in gold on a glass door. Okafor and Associates Trusts and Estates. The waiting room was elegant but not ostentatious, comfortable chairs and art that looked local, the kind of space designed to make people feel heard rather than judged. Jennifer came out to meet me herself. She looked exactly as I remembered, tall and composed, her hair in long braids, her handshake firm. But her eyes were different, sharper, carrying the weight of too many families destroying themselves over money. She led me back to her office, closed the door, and asked to see the will. I handed her the metal box. She opened it carefully, read the document in silence, then read it again. When she looked up, her expression was grave. She told me this was legitimate, that the witnesses and notarization were properly executed, that the date and circumstances would hold up under scrutiny. But she warned me that Patricia would fight with everything she had, that contested wills could take years to resolve, that I should be prepared for a battle that would cost me financially and emotionally. I asked Jennifer what my chances were. She leaned back in her chair, considering. She said that in probate law, the last valid will is the one that matters, and this will was clearly dated after the one Jonathan Matthews had read. But Patricia would argue that my father was mentally incompetent when he signed it, that the cancer and morphine had made him unable to understand what he was doing. We would need medical records, testimony from doctors who treated him, evidence that he had lucid periods when he was capable of making legal decisions. I told Jennifer about George Palmer, about his role as witness, about the letter my father had written. She listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions about timelines and who else might have known about the second will. When I mentioned that my mother was alive, that she'd been in hiding for 35 years, Jennifer's pen stopped moving. She looked at me, and I saw something shift in her expression. She asked if I had any proof of that, anything beyond my father's letter. I shook my head. Jennifer said we needed to find my mother, that her testimony would be crucial, that if she could speak to my father's state of mind and Patricia's history of manipulation, it would strengthen our case immeasurably. But finding someone who'd been hiding for 3.5 decades wasn't going to be easy. I told Jennifer about the monthly payments my father had made to an account in Portland, the ones that had stopped when he died. She asked if George knew the account number. I texted him, and he responded within minutes with a string of digits and the name of a bank. Jennifer made a call, spoke quietly to someone about subpoenas and financial records, then hung up and told me it would take a few days but she could trace where the money had been going. In the meantime, she wanted me to go back to Boston, to act as if nothing had changed, to not give Patricia any reason to suspect I'd found the second will. I didn't want to go back. The thought of seeing Patricia in my father's house, of pretending to pack up my belongings like an obedient daughter accepting her $50,000 consolation prize, made my stomach turn. But Jennifer was right. If Patricia knew I had the real will, she'd have time to prepare, to hide evidence, to create a narrative that painted me as a vengeful daughter trying to overturn my father's final wishes. Surprise was my only advantage. I needed to keep it. I drove back to Boston that afternoon, the metal box locked in my trunk beneath a spare tire and jumper cables. The city felt different now, darker somehow, Like I was seeing it through new eyes that recognized danger in familiar places. I went to my apartment in Somerville and found an eviction notice taped to my door. 30 days to vacate. Failure to comply would result in legal action. It was signed by a property management company I'd never heard of, and when I looked closer at the letterhead, I saw a subsidiary notation. A division of Bennett Holdings Group. Patricia had moved faster than I'd expected. She'd somehow arranged for my lease to be terminated, probably by buying the building or calling in favors with whoever owned it. It was a message clear and cold. She controlled everything now, including where I lived and how long I had to accept my new reality. I photographed the notice, sent it to Jennifer, and got a response within an hour. Illegal eviction. We'll fight it. But it confirmed what I already knew. Patricia wasn't just protecting her inheritance. She was actively trying to destroy me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my neighbors through thin walls, feeling the apartment shrink around me like a trap. At 2 a.m, I gave up and went to my laptop, searching for anything I could find about Catherine Williams Bennett. My mother had been erased so thoroughly that even the internet, which forgets nothing, barely remembered her. I found one newspaper article from 1987, a small piece in the Portland Press Herald about a woman who drowned while swimming near Harborview. The body was never recovered, the article said. Local authorities attributed the incident to strong currents and cold water. A private memorial service was held, survived by her husband Thomas Bennett and daughter Victoria. I read that line over and over. Survived by. But she hadn't died. She'd been sent away, forced into hiding by a man who'd chosen his company over his wife, his reputation over her safety. I wondered what that had been like for her, leaving her daughter behind, spending 3.5 decades in some unknown place, watching from a distance as I grew up without her. I wondered if she'd hated my father for it, if she'd ever forgiven him, if she even knew he was dead. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was George Palmer, his voice urgent and low. He told me not to go to the Beacon Hill house, that Patricia had hired a security company to change all the locks and install cameras, that she'd told the staff I was no longer welcome on the property. He said she'd been going through my father's papers, shredding documents, erasing files from his computer. Whatever evidence he'd kept about her embezzling, about the false will, she was systematically destroying it. I asked George if he had copies of anything, if my father had made backups. There was a long pause and then George said yes. My father had been paranoid in his final months, sensing that Patricia would try to rewrite history once he was gone. He'd created a secure digital archive, encrypted and stored on a remote server, with George as the only other person who had access. Financial records going back 20 years, emails between Patricia and Marcus discussing their schemes, forged documents with my father's signature, all of it preserved and waiting. George said he would send me the access codes, that I should download everything immediately and give it to Jennifer. But he warned me to be careful. Patricia had people watching, listening, reporting back to her. She knew I'd been to the lighthouse, knew I'd met with a lawyer in Portland, knew I wasn't going quietly. George's voice cracked when he said this, and I realized he was afraid, genuinely afraid of what Patricia might do if she felt threatened enough. I thanked him, told him he'd done more than anyone had a right to ask, that my father had been lucky to have him. George was quiet for a moment, then said my father had been a good man who'd made terrible choices, and the least George could do was help him make one good choice at the end. After we hung up, I sat in the blue light of my laptop screen and waited for the email. It came at 3 a.m, a simple message with a string of alphanumeric codes, and a URL that led to a login page. I entered the credentials and a directory appeared, folders organized by year and category, financial records, correspondence, legal documents, medical reports. Each one contained hundreds of files, a digital paper trail of everything Patricia and Marcus had done and everything my father had known but failed to stop. I started downloading, watching the progress bars crawl across my screen. It would take hours to get everything, and I didn't trust leaving it running while I slept. So I stayed awake, drinking coffee, reading through files at random. An email from Marcus to Patricia discussing how much they could skim before the auditors noticed. A forged document transferring company assets to an offshore shell corporation. A threatening letter Patricia had sent to my father when he'd questioned her about missing funds. reminding him that she knew things about Catherine's disappearance that could destroy his reputation and land him in prison as an accomplice. That last one made me stop. What did Patricia know about my mother? My father's letter had said he'd made a deal with Patricia, that Catherine would disappear and Patricia would stop stealing. But there was more to it, something darker implied in Patricia's threat. I searched through the folders for anything related to Catherine, and found a subfolder labeled simply 1987. Inside were police reports, insurance claims, and a series of photographs. The photograph showed the Grant family farm in Vermont, the place where my mother had grown up, where her parents had raised dairy cattle until they both died in a car accident when she was 19. The farm had belonged to my mother, her inheritance from a family that had worked that land for 4 generations. But according to the documents in the folder, the farm had burned down in October 1987, 4 months after my mother's supposed drowning. Arson was suspected but never proven. The insurance payout had gone to my father as Catherine's widower and heir. I felt sick. My father hadn't just sent my mother away. He'd stolen her inheritance, destroyed her family's legacy, and profited from it. And Patricia had known, had helped orchestrate it, had used that knowledge to control him for the rest of his life. The deal they'd made wasn't just about the embezzling. It was about mutual assured destruction, both of them holding secrets that could send the other to prison, locked in a marriage built on blackmail and shared guilt. By dawn, I had everything downloaded onto 3 separate hard drives, each one encrypted and hidden in a different location. One in my apartment, one in a safety deposit box at a bank in Cambridge, one shipped overnight to Jennifer's office in Portland. I wasn't taking chances. This evidence was the only thing standing between me and total erasure, and I would protect it the way my father should have protected my mother. I took a shower, put on clean clothes, and made myself breakfast I couldn't eat. At 8 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Jonathan Matthews, the lawyer who'd read the first will. His voice was strained, professional but uncomfortable. He said he needed to see me, that something had come to his attention regarding my father's estate, that it was urgent we meet as soon as possible. I told him I could be at his office in an hour. He said no, not the office, somewhere private. He suggested a park bench near the Charles River Esplanade, away from buildings and cameras and anyone who might overhear. I met him at 10, the morning cold and bright, joggers passing in steady streams, the river reflecting clouds like moving glass. Jonathan looked older than he had at the will reading, his face drawn, eyes nervous. He didn't sit down, just stood near the bench, hands in his coat pockets. He told me he'd been my father's attorney for 15 years, that he'd handled every major legal matter for the Bennett family, that he'd considered Thomas a friend, and he'd made a terrible mistake. The will he'd read at the office, he said, wasn't the one my father had given him. 3 weeks before Thomas died, he delivered a new will to Jonathan's office, sealed and notarized, with instructions that it be kept in the firm's vault and not opened until after his death. But when Jonathan had gone to retrieve it for the reading, the vault had contained a different document. Same blue legal backing, same witness signatures, but different contents. Someone had switched them. I asked him who had access to the vault. Jonathan's face tightened. Only senior partners at the firm, he said. And Patricia Bennett, who'd been given special access years ago because she'd done legal work for the firm before marrying my father. She'd been a paralegal, had keys to parts of the building, had maintained relationships with staff even after she'd stopped working. She would have known how to get into the vault, would have had time to make the switch while my father was dying and no one was paying attention to paperwork. Jonathan pulled out his phone and showed me something. A photograph of a security log from the firm's building, dated 6 days before my father's death. Patricia had signed in at 11 at night, claiming she needed to retrieve documents for Thomas's medical care. She'd been alone in the building for 47 minutes, long enough to open the vault, replace one will with another, and lock everything back up as if she'd never been there. I asked Jonathan why he was telling me this, why he was risking Patricia's wrath and possibly his career. He looked out at the river, watching a rowing crew slice through the water in perfect synchronization. He said because his job was to execute his client's true wishes, not to participate in fraud. He'd suspected something was wrong when he'd read the will, when the language hadn't sounded like Thomas, when the distributions had seemed designed to punish rather than reflect his values. But he'd had no proof until yesterday, when he'd asked the vault manager to pull the access logs and seen Patricia's name. He told me he couldn't officially help me, couldn't file documents or represent me in court, because it would create a conflict of interest and expose the firm to liability. But he could point me in the right direction, could tell me what I needed to prove and how to prove it. And he could testify, if it came to that, about the vault breach and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the will substitution. He said my father had deserved better than what his family had done to him, and I deserved better than being erased from my own inheritance. We stood there in silence for a moment, watching the river flow east toward the harbor. Jonathan finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been guilt or grief or just exhaustion from watching too many families destroy themselves over money. He told me to be careful, that Patricia had resources and connections, that she wouldn't hesitate to use every weapon at her disposal. Then he walked away, hands still in his pockets, shoulders bent like he was carrying something too heavy to hold upright. I sat on the bench after he left, feeling the cold seep through my coat. The pieces were coming together, the conspiracy revealing its full shape. Patricia had switched the wills, destroyed evidence, threatened George, and now she was systematically cutting me off from everything my father had left me. But she'd made mistakes. She'd left trails in security, logs and encrypted files and the memories of people like George and Jonathan, who'd cared about my father enough to risk telling the truth. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Found the account. Money was going to a trust in the name of C. M. Williams. Beneficiary lives in Kennebunkport. Sending you the address now. My breath caught. C. M. Williams. Catherine Margaret Williams. My mother. She was less than an hour away, living under her maiden name in a small coastal town I'd driven through 100 times without knowing she was there. I stood up from the bench, my legs unsteady, my heart hammering against my ribs. Everything was accelerating now, the truth emerging from decades of burial, pulling me toward a confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for. But ready or not, it was time to find my mother and tell her that the man who'd sent her away was dead, that the woman who'd stolen her life was about to lose everything, and that the daughter she'd left behind was finally coming home. The address Jennifer sent me led to a small cottage on Ocean Avenue in Kennebunkport, a street lined with weathered homes that faced the Atlantic with quiet dignity. I drove slowly, checking house numbers against the peeling paint on mailboxes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The cottage was pale yellow with dark green shutters, a garden out front that had been tended with obvious care, chrysanthemums still blooming despite the cold, a small herb garden protected by glass cloches. A bicycle leaned against the porch railing, its basket holding what looked like library books wrapped in a plastic bag. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, unable to move. What do you say to a mother who's been dead for 35 years? How do you introduce yourself to someone who left you when you were 6, who made a choice that had echoed through your entire life, shaping every relationship, every doubt, every moment you'd wondered if you were worth staying for? My therapist in graduate school had said I had abandonment issues, which was the kind of obvious diagnosis that cost $200 an hour to hear. Of course I had abandonment issues. My mother had drowned, or so I'd been told, and my father had replaced her with a woman who'd looked at me like I was something tracked in on the bottom of a shoe. But now I knew my mother hadn't drowned. She'd been forced into hiding, sent away to protect me, which was either the most selfless thing anyone had ever done or the most cowardly, depending on how you looked at it. My father's letter had said it was to keep me safe, to keep Patricia from using me as leverage. But sitting outside that yellow cottage, I couldn't help wondering if it had also been easier for both of them, if my mother had been relieved to escape a marriage that had clearly been troubled, if my father had been grateful not to fight a battle he didn't think he could win. A woman emerged from the cottage carrying a canvas shopping bag. She was in her early 70s, gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing jeans and a wool cardigan the color of rust. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested in the morning, locking the door behind her, checking it twice. When she turned toward the street toward me, I stopped breathing. She had my face. Or I had hers. The same narrow nose, the same wide-set eyes, the same way of holding her shoulders slightly hunched as if apologizing for taking up space. I'd spent my entire life looking in mirrors and seeing a stranger, wondering where my features had come from, which genetic lottery had produced me. Now I knew. Every photograph of my mother had been from a distance or slightly out of focus, Patricia making sure nothing clear enough remained to haunt the house. But here she was, alive and solid and walking toward a blue sedan parked in her driveway. I got out of my car before I could talk myself out of it. My legs felt disconnected from my body, moving on their own authority. I crossed the street and called out, my voice cracking on a name I hadn't said out loud since I was a child. She turned, her expression polite but guarded. The look people give strangers in small towns where everyone knows everyone and you clearly don't belong. Then her eyes met mine, and the shopping bag slipped from her hands, spilling apples and a loaf of bread onto the driveway. She said my name not as a question but as a recognition, the way you might say the name of someone you'd seen in a dream. Victoria. She took a step forward, then stopped, her hand rising to her mouth. I could see her trying to reconcile the 6-year-old she'd left behind with the 41-year-old woman standing in front of her. Tears filled her eyes, spilled over, ran down cheeks that looked weathered by ocean wind and decades of grief. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that made sense. He's gone. Dad died 6 months ago. She nodded slowly, her hand still covering her mouth, and I realized she already knew. Of course she knew. She'd been watching from a distance all this time, reading obituaries, following news about Bennett Maritime Holdings, tracking the life she'd been forced to abandon. She'd known he was dying and she'd stayed away, kept her promise, protected the secret that had kept me safe even as it destroyed her. We stood there in her driveway while neighbors walked dogs and cars past, and the world continued without acknowledging that something impossible was happening. Finally, she bent down and started gathering the spilled groceries, her movements mechanical, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed. I knelt beside her, picking up apples that had rolled under her car, and our hands touched when we both reached for the same one. Her skin was cold, papery, marked with age spots I didn't remember. She pulled back as if I'd burned her. She asked if I wanted to come inside. Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse or emotion or both. I nodded and she led me up the porch steps, fumbling with her keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. The interior of the cottage was small but immaculate, hardwood floors covered with faded rugs, furniture that looked secondhand but well cared for, walls lined with bookshelves and watercolor paintings of coastal scenes. Everything was modest, carefully budgeted, the home of someone who'd learned to live on very little. She put the groceries away in a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, her back to me, movements precise and controlled. I stood in the doorway, not sure if I should sit or help her leave. When she finally turned around, she'd composed herself, wiping her face with a dish towel, straightening her cardigan. She asked if I wanted tea. I said yes, even though I hated tea because it was something to do, a ritual that might make this surreal moment feel more bearable. We sat at a small table near a window, overlooking the ocean. She poured tea from a ceramic pot painted with flowers, her hands shaking slightly. I watched her, cataloging every detail, trying to memorize a face I'd thought I'd lost forever. She had wrinkles around her eyes and mouth, lines earned from smiling or squinting at the sun or crying alone in the dark. Her hands were those of someone who worked with them, calloused and strong despite her age. A scar ran along her left forearm, pale and old, from some accident I'd never know about. She spoke first, her voice steadier now. She said she'd wanted to come back so many times, wanted to show up at my school or my apartment or anywhere I might be, just to see me, to make sure I was all right. But she'd made a promise to my father, a binding agreement that if she disappeared and stayed disappeared, Patricia would leave me alone, would let me grow up without being used as a pawn in their twisted game. Breaking that promise would have put me in danger, would have given Patricia leverage to manipulate my father even more than she already did. I asked her how she'd survived all these years, how she'd lived with the decision to leave her daughter behind. She looked down at her tea, watching steam rise and dissipate. She said she'd worked whatever job she could find, cleaning houses at first, then learning bookkeeping, eventually working for a small accounting firm in Portland that didn't ask too many questions about her past. The money my father sent had covered rent and food, enough to survive but not enough to thrive, a monthly reminder of what she'd given up. She'd built a quiet life, made a few careful friendships, volunteered at a local literacy program, tried to fill the emptiness with purpose. But she'd never stopped watching. She had scrapbooks, she told me, newspaper clippings about my achievements, printed articles from academic journals when I'd published my research, photographs she'd taken from a distance at my college graduation, standing at the back of the crowd where I wouldn't see her. She stood up and retrieved a leather-bound album from a shelf, placed it on the table between us. Inside were decades of my life, documented by a ghost, a mother who'd existed in the margins, collecting proof that I'd survived without her. I turned the pages slowly, seeing myself through her eyes. My high school yearbook photo, clipped from some newsletter. An announcement of my acceptance to graduate school. A grainy image of me presenting at a conference, probably taken from the conference website. She'd built a life around absence, around the empty space where I should have been, and somehow she'd kept going. I didn't know if that made her strong or broken or both. I told her about the will, about Patricia's betrayal, about finding my father's letter in the lighthouse. I told her he'd left everything to me, that his final act had been to undo some of the damage he'd caused, to give me the inheritance Patricia had tried to steal. My mother listened without interrupting, her face carefully neutral, and when I finished, she asked the question I'd been dreading. She asked if I hated him, if I'd spent 35 years hating the man who'd sent my mother away and lied about her death. I thought about it, really thought about it, trying to untangle the complicated mess of emotions that had defined my relationship with my father. I told her I didn't hate him, but I didn't forgive him either. He'd been weak when he should have been strong, selfish when he should have been selfless, and he'd let his fear make decisions that had scarred everyone involved. But in the end he tried to make it right, in the only way he knew how, by giving me the tools to fight Patricia and reclaim what was mine. That didn't erase the damage, didn't heal the wounds, but it was something. It was an apology written in legal documents and hidden wills, and maybe that was the only language he'd known how to speak. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She said my father had loved me, in his broken inadequate way, and that he'd loved her too before ambition and Patricia had poisoned everything. She said the worst prison was the one you built yourself, and my father had lived in one for 35 years, trapped by choices he couldn't undo and secrets he couldn't tell. She didn't excuse what he'd done, but she'd made her peace with it, had forgiven him years ago because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. I asked her if she'd testify, if she'd come back to Boston and tell a judge what Patricia had done, how she'd forced this arrangement, how she'd embezzled and blackmailed and turned my father into an accomplice. My mother's face tightened. She said she'd spent 35 years invisible, living under the radar, avoiding anything that might draw attention. The thought of standing in a courtroom, of having her name in legal documents, of being visible again terrified her. But she also said she hadn't left her daughter just to watch that daughter be destroyed by the same woman who'd driven her into hiding. She would testify, she said. She would tell the truth, the whole ugly truth, and face whatever consequences came from breaking her silence. But she needed time to prepare, to shore up her courage, to accept that the quiet life she'd built was about to shatter. I told her I understood, that I wouldn't ask her to do anything she wasn't ready for, but that I needed her to know how much it meant to me, having her back, knowing she'd existed all this time in the spaces between my memories. We talked for hours, the afternoon light fading to evening, the ocean beyond the window turning dark and restless. She told me about her parents, my grandparents I'd never known, how they'd worked the Vermont farm with their hands and their backs, how they'd taught her that land was something you cared for, not something you owned. She told me about meeting my father, how charming he'd been, how ambitious, how certain that he could build something great if he just worked hard enough. She'd loved that certainty, that drive, until she realized it had no room for anything that couldn't be measured in profit margins. I told her about my work, about studying coral reefs and kelp forests, about documenting ecosystems on the edge of collapse, about finding meaning in trying to understand the natural world, even when I couldn't understand my own family. She smiled, said I'd gotten that from her, that love of things that grew slowly and quietly, that patience with processes that couldn't be rushed. She said she'd read all my papers, even the ones filled with technical jargon she barely understood, because they were proof that I'd become someone good, someone who asked important questions, someone who cared about things that mattered. As the room grew darker, she turned on a small lamp, its light warm and yellow. She asked if I had anywhere to be, if I needed to drive back to Boston tonight. I told her about the eviction notice, about Patricia buying the building, about having 30 days to leave the only home I'd had since graduate school. My mother's expression hardened, the first anger I'd seen from her. She said I could stay here, that she had a spare room, that it wasn't much but it was mine if I needed it. The offer broke something in me. Some last defense I'd been holding against the weight of everything. I cried, really cried, the kind of tears that come from somewhere so deep they feel like they'll never stop. She moved around the table and held me, and I smelled lavender and salt air and something underneath that was just her. The scent I'd forgotten but somehow recognized. She whispered that she was sorry, that she should have fought harder, should have found a way to stay, should have protected me better. I told her it wasn't her fault, that she'd been trapped by impossible choices, that survival sometimes looked like abandonment, but was really just love doing the best it could with terrible options. We stayed like that until the tears stopped, until I could breathe normally again, until the grief had run its course and left behind something that might eventually become healing. She made dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables from her garden, and we ate in comfortable silence, two women who'd been strangers that morning and were now tentatively, carefully, beginning to rebuild something that had been broken before I was old enough to understand what was being lost. That night I slept in her spare room, in a bed with clean sheets that smelled like line drying, under a quilt she'd made herself from fabric scraps. The room was simple, just a bed and a dresser and a window that faced the ocean. I lay awake listening to waves, to the house settling, to my mother moving quietly in the room next door. I thought about Patricia sleeping in the Beacon Hill mansion, surrounded by stolen comfort, believing she'd won. I thought about Marcus and Lauren dividing their inheritance, planning their futures, certain that I'd been successfully erased. They didn't know I'd found the second will. They didn't know my mother was alive. They didn't know that everything they'd taken was about to be ripped away. In the morning I woke to the smell of coffee and found my mother already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad covered in neat handwriting. She'd been awake most of the night, she said, writing down everything she remembered about Patricia's embezzling, about the threats, about the deal she'd made with my father. Names, dates, amounts, every detail she could recall. She said if she was going to testify, she wanted to be prepared, wanted to give Jennifer everything she needed to build an airtight case. I called Jennifer from the cottage, put her on speaker so my mother could hear. Jennifer's voice was professional, but I could hear the excitement underneath. She said my mother's testimony would be devastating to Patricia's defense, that combined with the financial records George had preserved in Jonathan Matthews' statement about the switched wills, we had enough to not only win the inheritance case but potentially file criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The case would be complicated, Jennifer warned, and it would take months, but she was confident we would prevail. My mother asked Jennifer what the risks were, what Patricia might do if she felt cornered. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful. She said Patricia had already shown she was willing to destroy evidence, threaten witnesses, and abuse her power. It was possible she might escalate, might try to discredit my mother or me, might even attempt something more dangerous. We would need to be careful, to document everything, to never be alone with her or anyone loyal to her. Jennifer said she would file for a restraining order, would notify the police about potential threats, would do everything legally possible to protect us. After the call ended, my mother and I sat in silence, both of us understanding that we'd crossed a threshold we couldn't uncross. We were committed now, to the fight, to the truth, to each other. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I saw in her eyes the same determination I felt building in myself. We'd been victims long enough. It was time to stop running and start fighting. I spent the next 3 days in Kennebunkport, helping my mother prepare her testimony, going through old photographs and documents she'd saved, building a timeline of Patricia's crimes. We worked side by side at her kitchen table, papers spread across every surface, reconstructing a history that had been deliberately obscured. My mother remembered things with startling clarity, conversations she'd overheard, bank statements she'd seen, warnings she'd given my father that he'd ignored. She'd known Patricia was dangerous from the beginning, had tried to make him see it, but he'd been blinded by loneliness and Patricia's calculated charm. In the evenings we walked along the beach, bundled against the cold, talking about things that had nothing to do with wills or inheritance or betrayal. She told me about books she'd read, about the literacy program where she helped adults learn to read, about a stray cat that had adopted her and refused to leave. I told her about my research, about diving in cold water among forests of kelp, about the strange beauty of ecosystems most people never saw. We were learning each other again, building a relationship from fragments, and it felt both familiar and entirely new. On the fourth day, Jennifer called with news. She'd filed the second will with the probate court, along with supporting documentation and a motion to invalidate the first will based on fraud. Patricia had been served that morning. Jennifer said the reaction had been immediate and explosive. Patricia's lawyers had called within an hour, threatening countersuits, demanding meetings, insisting the second will was a forgery. But Jennifer had anticipated this, had documentation proving the will's authenticity, had statements from George and Jonathan ready to file if needed. The real shock, Jennifer said, came when Patricia's lawyers learned that Catherine Bennett was alive and prepared to testify. There had been a long silence on the phone, followed by heated conversation Jennifer could hear in the background. Patricia knew what my mother's testimony would mean, knew that her entire defense would crumble once a judge heard how she'd forced Catherine into hiding, how she'd manipulated my father, how she'd built her empire on blackmail and theft. Jennifer said we needed to move quickly, that Patricia would be scrambling to build a counter-narrative, to discredit us before the case went to court. She'd scheduled depositions for the following week, wanted my mother and me in her office, wanted to prepare us for the kind of aggressive questioning Patricia's lawyers would employ. She warned us they would try to paint my mother as a woman who'd abandoned her child, would suggest the second will was a fabrication I'd created in revenge, would argue that my father's cancer had made him incompetent and easy to manipulate. We needed to be ready for character assassination, for lies told convincingly, for a fight that would get ugly before it got better. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the spare room listening to the ocean and thought about what was coming. A public battle, our lives examined in court documents and legal filings, our pain turned into evidence and cross-examination. Patricia would use every weapon she had, would drag us through humiliation and doubt, would try to destroy us the way she destroyed everything else she'd touched. But for the first time in my life I wasn't alone. I had my mother returned from the dead. I had Jennifer fighting beside us. I had George and Jonathan risking their own security to tell the truth. And I had the will, my father's final act of courage, his last attempt to be the man he should have been all along. In the morning my mother and I drove back to Portland together. She sat in the passenger seat, watching the coastline pass, her hands folded in her lap. She'd packed a small suitcase, enough clothes for a week, though we both knew it might be much longer before she could come home. She was leaving her safe, quiet life behind, stepping back into a world that had tried to erase her, and she was doing it for me. The weight of that gift, that sacrifice, settled in my chest like an anchor. We met Jennifer at her office, and for the next 6 hours we went over every detail of our case. Jennifer was thorough, relentless, playing the role of Patricia's lawyers, asking the hard questions we would face in deposition. She pushed my mother on why she'd left me, why she hadn't fought, why she'd accepted my father's money if she was so opposed to his choices. She pushed me on my relationship with my father, on whether I'd influenced him while he was dying, on whether my sudden appearance with a second will was just convenient timing. It was brutal, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. By the end of the session, my mother and I had our stories straight, our answers prepared, our vulnerabilities identified and defended. Jennifer said we were ready as anyone could be for the kind of warfare Patricia would wage. She reminded us to document everything, to never communicate with Patricia or her family directly, to route all contact through her office. And she told us something else, something that made my blood run cold. Patricia had hired a private investigator. Someone had been asking questions in Kennebunkport, talking to my mother's neighbors, photographing her cottage, digging into her life. Jennifer said this was normal in high-stakes litigation, that wealthy families often used investigators to find leverage, but we should assume we were being watched. My mother's face went pale. She'd spent 35 years invisible, and now someone was deliberately making her visible, exposing her, marking her as a target. I wanted to pull out, to tell Jennifer this was too dangerous, that no amount of money was worth putting my mother at risk. But my mother stopped me. She said she'd spent 3.5 decades hiding and she was done. If Patricia wanted to investigate her, let her investigate. All she'd find was a woman who'd survived impossible circumstances, who'd built a decent life from nothing, who'd never stopped loving her daughter. There was no shame in that, no secret that could be weaponized. My mother had nothing left to lose, which made her more dangerous than Patricia could possibly understand. We left Jennifer's office as the sun was setting, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement. My mother and I checked into a modest hotel near the waterfront, 2 rooms connected by an adjoining door we left open. We ordered takeout, ate while watching the news, both of us too tired to talk. But before we went to our separate rooms, my mother hugged me, held me tight, and whispered that whatever happened, we would face it together. She'd lost 35 years with me, and she wasn't losing another day. I lay in bed that night thinking about justice, about what it meant and what it cost. My father had tried to buy it with a hidden will and encrypted files. My mother was risking her safety for it. George and Jonathan were jeopardizing their careers for it. And I was fighting for it, not just for the money or the property or the company, but for something more fundamental. The right to exist, to be seen, to claim the space that was rightfully mine. Patricia had tried to erase me, to make me small and forgettable, to push me so far to the margins I'd simply disappear. But I was still here. And I wasn't disappearing. Not anymore. The depositions began on a Tuesday morning in a conference room that felt designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston Harbor, the water gray and choppy under storm clouds that had rolled in overnight. Patricia's legal team had chosen the location deliberately, a high-rise office building owned by one of Marcus's business partners, every detail calculated to remind us who held power. 3 lawyers sat across the mahogany table, 2 men in suits that probably cost more than my car, and a woman whose expression suggested she'd spent years perfecting the art of making people feel small. Patricia herself sat at the end of the table, perfectly composed in navy blue, her hands folded, her face a mask of wounded dignity. My mother sat beside me, her back straight, wearing a simple gray dress we'd bought the day before. Jennifer was on my other side, her laptop open, legal pads arranged with military precision. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers poised over her stenography machine, ready to record every word, every pause, every moment of the battle about to unfold. The lead attorney introduced himself as Richard Chamberlain, senior partner at Chamberlain & Wells, his voice smooth and practiced. He thanked us for coming as if we'd had a choice, as if this wasn't a legal requirement. Then he looked directly at my mother, and his expression shifted, became something that might have been curiosity or might have been strategy disguised as curiosity. He began with the obvious question, asking her to state her full name for the record. Catherine Margaret Williams Bennett, my mother said, her voice steady. The stenographer's fingers flew. Patricia's lawyers exchanged glances. Chamberlain leaned forward slightly and asked how long she'd been using the name Catherine Williams instead of Catherine Bennett. My mother said she'd reverted to her maiden name 35 years ago, after her husband arranged for her to disappear, after she'd been forced to choose between her safety and her daughter's well-being. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Chamberlain didn't react, just moved to his next question, asking my mother to describe the circumstances that led to her disappearance. Jennifer objected, said the question was vague and called for narrative. Chamberlain rephrased, asked my mother to tell him what happened in the spring of 1987 that caused her to leave her family. My mother took a breath, looked at me, then looked back at Chamberlain. She told him she discovered financial irregularities in Bennett Maritime Holdings, transfers to offshore accounts that couldn't be explained, signatures that looked like my father's but weren't quite right. She'd confronted my father, shown him the documents, begged him to report it to the authorities. But he'd been afraid, my mother said. Afraid of scandal, afraid of destroying the company his grandfather had built, afraid of Patricia. Because by then, he'd already married Patricia, already brought her into the business, already given her access to everything. And when my mother insisted they go to the police, Patricia had made it clear what would happen. She'd claim my father was complicit, that he'd authorized the transfers, that together they'd been embezzling for years. She had documents to prove it, forged but convincing, enough to send my father to prison. Unless my mother disappeared. Chamberlain interrupted, asked if Patricia had explicitly threatened her. My mother said yes. Patricia had come to their home, to the Beacon Hill house, and told my mother that if she didn't leave, if she didn't take the deal being offered, my father would go to prison and I would end up in foster care. Patricia had connections at Child Protective Services, she'd said, Friends who could make sure I never saw my father again. So my mother had a choice. Leave and know I was safe, or stay and watch everything collapse. The conference room was silent except for the sound of the stenographer's machine. Patricia's face remained impassive, but I saw her jaw tighten, saw her fingers press together. Chamberlain made a note on his legal pad, then asked my mother if she had any proof of these threats, any recordings or witnesses or documentation. My mother said no, it had been a private conversation, just the two of them, Patricia's word against hers. Chamberlain smiled slightly, as if this was the answer he'd been hoping for. He moved on, asked about the money my father had sent her over the years, monthly payments that totaled more than $2 million. He asked if that wasn't essentially blackmail, my mother demanding payment in exchange for her silence. Jennifer objected immediately, said the question was argumentative and assumed facts not in evidence. Chamberlain withdrew the question but said they'd return to it later. He asked instead about my mother's relationship with me, why she'd never attempted to contact me, why she'd allowed me to believe she was dead. My mother's voice wavered for the first time. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, walking away from her daughter, letting me think she'd drowned. But she believed it was temporary, believed that once the embezzling investigation was over, once Patricia was prosecuted, she could come back. She'd never imagined it would be 35 years. She'd never imagined my father would protect Patricia instead of exposing her, would spend decades trapped in a marriage built on mutual blackmail, would wait until he was dying to finally try to make things right. Chamberlain asked if she'd watched me grow up from a distance. My mother said yes. He asked if that wasn't stalking, if following her own daughter, photographing her, collecting information about her without her knowledge or consent wasn't a violation. Jennifer objected again, said opposing counsel was harassing the witness. The female lawyer who'd introduced herself as Monica Reeves spoke up, said they were simply trying to establish a pattern of behavior, trying to understand what kind of mother abandons her child, and then claims it was for that child's protection. I felt rage rising in my chest, hot and immediate. Jennifer put a hand on my arm, a subtle warning to stay calm, to let her handle it. She said her client had answered the question, that she'd left to protect her daughter from Patricia's threats, and that twisting that sacrifice into something sinister was exactly the kind of bad faith tactic she'd expected from this legal team. Chamberlain said they were simply seeking the truth, and Jennifer said the truth was that Patricia Bennett had committed multiple felonies, and was now trying to destroy anyone who might expose her. The deposition continued for 6 hours, breaking only for lunch that none of us could eat. Chamberlain went through every year of my mother's exile, asking about jobs, addresses, relationships, trying to find something that would discredit her. He asked if she'd filed taxes, if she'd used a social security number that wasn't hers, if she'd ever broken the law in her efforts to stay hidden. My mother answered everything calmly, admitted she'd worked under the table for the first few years, admitted she'd been afraid to leave a paper trail, admitted she'd done what she had to do to survive. Then it was my turn. Chamberlain turned his attention to me, asked me to describe my relationship with my father. I told him it had been distant, complicated, that I'd spent most of my life feeling like I didn't quite belong in his world. He asked if I resented him. I said yes sometimes. He asked if I blamed him for my mother's death. I said I had before I learned she was alive. He asked if finding out she'd been alive all this time had made me angry at my father. I said it had made me angry at everyone who'd lied, including him. Chamberlain asked about the lighthouse, how I'd known to look there, how I'd known the combination to open the hidden panel. I told him about my father's letter, about George Palmer giving me the information I needed. He asked if I'd known about the second will before my father died. I said no. He asked if I'd had any contact with my father in his final weeks. I said I'd visited him twice, both times he'd been heavily sedated, barely conscious. He asked if I'd discussed his will during those visits. I said no, we'd barely spoken at all. He showed me a document, a visitor log from the hospice facility where my father had died. My signature appeared 3 times, not twice. I looked at it, confused, and realized someone had forged my name. The handwriting was close but not quite right, the loops slightly different. I told Chamberlain I hadn't signed that log, that I'd only visited twice, that someone had falsified the record. He asked who would do that. I said whoever wanted to make it look like I'd been manipulating my father, Whoever was trying to suggest the second will had been my idea instead of his. Jennifer jumped in, asked to see the document, compared it to my actual signature on other papers. She pointed out the differences, said clearly someone had doctored the log to support their narrative. Monica Reeves said that was speculation, that my denial was convenient but not conclusive. Jennifer said we'd be happy to have a handwriting expert examine the document, that we were confident it would prove forgery. Chamberlain made a note, said they'd consider that, moved on to the next question. He asked about my finances, how much debt I had, whether I needed money. I told him I lived comfortably on my salary, that I'd never asked my father for financial support as an adult, that I deliberately kept my distance from his wealth. He asked if $50,000 seemed like enough inheritance given my father's net worth of $340 million. I said it had seemed like exactly what I'd expected, which was close to nothing. He asked if that had made me angry. I said it had made me sad because it confirmed what I'd always believed, that I didn't matter to him. Chamberlain paused, seemed to consider his next move. He asked if I'd ever threatened Patricia or my father, if I'd ever expressed a desire to see them suffer. I said no, I just wanted to be left alone. He pulled out another document, an email allegedly from me, sent 2 years earlier, full of angry accusations about how my father had destroyed my childhood and how Patricia had poisoned our family. I looked at it, felt my stomach drop. I'd never written that email. The address was similar to mine but not exact, off by one letter, a sophisticated fake. Jennifer demanded to know where they'd obtained that email, said it was clearly fabricated, said we'd be reporting this to the Bar Association for suborning false evidence. Chamberlain said it had been provided by Patricia, who'd received it 2 years ago, who'd been so disturbed by it she'd saved it. Jennifer said that was convenient, that Patricia had sat on this alleged threat for 2 years and only produced it now, when she was facing fraud charges. She said no judge would believe it, that it was obviously manufactured to make me look unstable. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Patricia finally spoke, her voice soft and wounded. She said I'd always resented her, always blamed her for my father's distance, always looked at her like she was an intruder. She said she'd tried to be a good stepmother, had tried to include me in family decisions, but I'd rejected every overture. She said my father had been heartbroken by my coldness, had died still hoping I'd forgive him for remarrying, never knowing I was planning to contest his will and destroy his final wishes. I stared at her across the table. This woman who'd stolen my mother's life, who'd embezzled millions, who'd manipulated my father into becoming an accomplice to her crimes. She was good, I had to admit. Her performance was flawless, the wronged stepmother, the grieving widow, the protective matriarch trying to honor her husband's memory. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't seen the documents and read my father's letter, I might have believed her. But I did know the truth, and I wasn't going to let her rewrite history. I leaned forward, looked directly at Patricia, and said she was lying. I said she'd never tried to include me, had actively pushed me away, had made it clear from the moment she married my father that I was an obstacle to be removed. I said she'd switched the wills, had destroyed evidence, had threatened George Palmer, and was now fabricating emails and visitor logs because she knew the truth would destroy her. Jennifer tried to stop me, said I should only answer questions, shouldn't volunteer information. But I kept going. I said my father had left me everything because he'd finally understood what Patricia was, because in his last lucid moments he'd remembered the man he used to be, the man who'd loved my mother, the man who'd had values before Patricia corrupted them. I said the second will was his apology, his attempt to undo the damage, his final act of courage after years of cowardice. And I said I would fight for it, would expose every crime Patricia had committed, would make sure everyone knew what she'd done to my family. The room was absolutely silent. Chamberlain cleared his throat, said we should take a break, that emotions were running high. Jennifer agreed, gathered her papers, guided my mother and me out of the conference room. In the hallway, she told me I'd done well until the end, that the outburst had given them ammunition, that I needed to control my temper. I said I was done being controlled, done being careful, done protecting people who'd hurt me. Jennifer's expression softened. She said she understood, but this was a legal battle, not an emotional one, and winning required discipline. We didn't go back after the break. Jennifer sent a message saying her clients were exhausted, that we'd resume the following day. We left the building and walked to Jennifer's car in silence. My mother looked pale, shaken, older than she had that morning. I asked if she was all right. She said she'd forgotten what Patricia was like, how convincing she could be, how she could twist truth into lies and make people believe her. I told my mother I believed her, that nothing Patricia said would change that. My mother smiled weakly, said she hoped the judge would feel the same way. That night we stayed at Jennifer's house, a comfortable colonial in Newton with a guest room, and a dog that greeted us like we were family. Jennifer made pasta, opened wine, tried to lighten the mood. She said depositions were always ugly, that Patricia's lawyers were doing exactly what she'd expected, trying to rattle us, trying to find inconsistencies they could exploit. But she said we'd held up well, that our stories were consistent, that the forged documents would actually help us because they showed how desperate Patricia was. The next morning we returned for my deposition. This time I was ready, controlled, careful. Chamberlain asked the same questions in different ways, trying to trip me up, trying to get me to contradict something I'd said the day before. But I stuck to the facts, answered only what was asked, refused to be baited into emotional responses. When he asked about my relationship with my mother, when he suggested we'd conspired to create the second will, when he implied I was using her to legitimize a forgery, I simply said no, that wasn't what happened, that we could both submit to polygraph tests if that would help establish our credibility. Jennifer had advised against offering the polygraph, said it was risky, but I was confident in the truth. Chamberlain seemed surprised, made a note, said they'd consider it. Monica Reeves took over, focused on the technical details of the will, asked how I'd known where to look, why my father would hide such an important document instead of keeping it with his attorney. I said he'd been afraid of Patricia, afraid she'd destroy it, afraid that if he kept it anywhere she had access, it would disappear. I said the lighthouse was the one place she'd never been, the one property she'd never controlled, the one safe place he could think of. Reeves asked why he hadn't just divorced Patricia if he was so afraid of her. I said because she'd threatened to expose him as an accomplice to the embezzling, because she had forged documents with his signature, because divorcing her would have meant prison and losing everything. He'd been trapped, caught in a web of his own bad decisions, and he'd spent 3 decades looking for a way out. The second will was that way out, his escape plan, his attempt to finally do the right thing even though it came too late to undo all the harm. The depositions ended on Friday afternoon. We were all exhausted, wrung out, barely capable of conversation. Jennifer said the next phase would be court hearings, that Patricia's lawyers would file motions to dismiss, would argue the second will was invalid, would try every legal maneuver they could think of. But Jennifer was confident, said we had the stronger case, said judges didn't like families that manipulated dying relatives and destroyed evidence. She said it would take months, maybe a year, but she believed we would win. My mother and I drove back to Kennebunkport that evening, through rain that turned the highway into a river of red taillights. We didn't talk much, just listened to the radio, let the miles pass. When we finally pulled up to her cottage, the windows dark, the garden soaked, she turned to me and said she was proud of me, proud of how I'd handled the depositions, proud of the woman I'd become despite everything. I told her I couldn't have done it without her, without knowing she was real, without having her beside me. The following weeks blurred together. Jennifer filed motion after motion, each one carefully crafted, each one backed by evidence that was increasingly difficult for Patricia to refute. George Palmer gave his deposition, testified about the secure server, about my father's instructions, about witnessing the second will. Jonathan Matthews gave his deposition, explained the vault breach, provided security logs showing Patricia had been in the building the night the wills were switched. The case against Patricia was building, becoming undeniable, a mountain of evidence she couldn't climb. But Patricia fought back with everything she had. Her investigators dug into my mother's past, found the years she'd worked without documentation, filed complaints with immigration authorities even though my mother was a citizen. They filed ethics complaints against Jennifer, claiming she'd manufactured evidence. They leaked stories to the press, painting me as a bitter daughter trying to steal an inheritance I didn't deserve, painting my mother as a grifter who'd abandoned her child and was now exploiting her for money. The publicity was brutal. Reporters camped outside Jennifer's office, outside my mother's cottage, outside every location connected to the case. News vans blocked streets, cameras tracked our movements, strangers offered opinions about people they'd never met. The headlines were cruel, sensational, designed to generate clicks rather than truth. Daughter claims dead mother alive and will dispute. Family fortune triggers war between widow and stepdaughter. Billionaire's secret will sparks allegations of fraud. My mother stopped leaving her house. The attention terrified her. Undid years of carefully maintained invisibility. She built a life on being overlooked, and suddenly she was the center of a media circus. I stayed with her. Deflected reporters refused to comment, tried to shield her from the worst of it. But there was no escaping it. The story had taken on a life of its own, had become entertainment for people who didn't understand that real lives were being destroyed by their casual consumption of our pain. 3 months after the depositions, Jennifer called with news. The judge had scheduled a hearing, would review the evidence and make a preliminary ruling on which will should be admitted to probate. It wasn't the final decision, but it was crucial. If the judge sided with us, admitted the second will, it would shift momentum entirely. If the judge sided with Patricia, ruled the second will was invalid or questionable, we'd be fighting uphill for years. The hearing was set for a cold morning in January, the courthouse steps slick with ice, protesters on both sides holding signs. Some supported Patricia, claimed I was trying to steal from a grieving widow, called my mother a liar and a fraud. Others supported us, held signs saying justice for Catherine and truth over money. I'd never asked for a public spectacle, never wanted strangers taking sides in my family's destruction, but there was no controlling it now. Inside, the courtroom was wood-paneled and solemn, a place built to make people feel the weight of law. Judge Margaret Thornton presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for impatience with legal games. She'd read all the filings, reviewed all the evidence, and her first question was directed at Patricia's lawyers. She asked them to explain how their client had accessed a secure vault in the middle of the night, weeks before Thomas Bennett's death, if she hadn't been there to switch the wills. Chamberlain stood, smoothed his tie, said his client had been retrieving medical documents, had every right to access files related to her husband's care, had done nothing wrong. Judge Thornton asked why medical documents would be stored in a vault designated for estate planning materials. Chamberlain said the documents were mixed together, that Thomas had been disorganized in his final months, that there was no evidence Patricia had tampered with anything. The judge looked unimpressed, made a note, moved on. She asked Jennifer to present the second will, to explain its provenance, to establish the chain of custody. Jennifer walked her through everything. The lighthouse location, the hidden panel, the combination based on Catherine Bennett's birthday, the metal box containing the will and letter. She presented photographs, video of the lamp room, testimony from George Palmer about helping Thomas hide the will. She presented the digital archives, the financial records showing Patricia's embezzling, the forged signatures, the evidence of conspiracy that spanned decades. Judge Thornton asked my mother to stand, asked her to confirm her identity. My mother rose, her voice clear, said she was Catherine Margaret Williams Bennett, born June 14, 1952, married to Thomas Bennett in 1974, mother to Victoria Bennett. The judge asked why she'd allowed her daughter to believe she was dead for 35 years. My mother said because she'd been threatened, because staying hidden had been the only way to keep her daughter safe, because she'd believed Thomas when he said it was temporary. The judge asked if she had proof of these threats. My mother said no, it had been her word against Patricia's. The judge asked if that didn't make her testimony unreliable, based on claims that couldn't be verified. My mother said the proof was in Patricia's actions, in the embezzling that was documented, in the switched wills, in the destroyed evidence, in the pattern of behavior that showed what Patricia was capable of. She said if the court looked at everything Patricia had done, everything she tried to hide, it would become clear that the threats were real, that the danger had been real, that her choice to disappear had been the desperate act of a mother trying to protect her child. The courtroom was silent. Judge Thornton studied my mother for a long moment, then nodded, said she could sit. The judge reviewed documents, asked questions about signatures and dates and witnesses, probed for weaknesses in both sides' arguments. Finally, she announced she'd take the matter under advisement, would issue a written ruling within 30 days. Court was adjourned. We stood as she left, and then the room erupted in whispers and movement. Outside, reporters swarmed, shouting questions we didn't answer. Jennifer guided us to her car, drove us away from the courthouse, away from the cameras, to a quiet restaurant where we could decompress. She said it had gone well, that the judge seemed skeptical of Patricia's explanations, that asking about the vault access was a good sign. But she cautioned us not to celebrate yet, that judges were unpredictable, that we wouldn't know anything until the ruling came down. The next 30 days were agony. I tried to work, tried to focus on my research, but every day felt like waiting for a verdict that would determine my entire future. My mother and I stayed together, two women who'd found each other after decades apart, now bound by a legal battle neither of us had wanted. We talked about what we'd do if we won, how we'd handle the inheritance, what we'd do with Bennett Maritime Holdings. My mother said she wanted no part of it, that money had destroyed my father and she wouldn't let it destroy us. I said I wanted to sell the company, donate most of the proceeds, keep enough to be comfortable but not enough to be corrupted. But mostly we talked about what we'd do if we lost, how we'd move forward, how we'd build lives that weren't defined by this fight. My mother said she'd survive 35 years of exile. She could survive losing in court. I said I'd survived growing up feeling unwanted. I could survive being erased from my father's will. We told each other we'd be fine either way, but we both knew we were lying, knew that losing would break something in us that might not heal. The ruling came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by email at 8:15. Jennifer called immediately, her voice shaking with something that sounded like triumph. She said to get to her office, that we needed to read it together, that we'd won the first battle. My mother and I drove to Portland in silence, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. In Jennifer's office, she pulled up the ruling on her laptop, turned the screen so we could read. Judge Thornton had admitted the second will to probate, had ruled that it was properly executed and represented Thomas Bennett's true final wishes. She'd found that the first will had been obtained through undue influence and fraud, that Patricia Bennett had manipulated a dying man and switched documents to benefit herself. She'd ordered the estate frozen, had appointed an independent administrator, had begun the process of investigating Patricia for criminal charges. The ruling was 12 pages long, methodical and damning. The judge wrote that she found Catherine Bennett's testimony credible, that the documentary evidence supported every claim she'd made, that Patricia's explanations for her vault access and the switched will strained credulity to the breaking point. She wrote that Thomas Bennett had clearly been afraid of his wife, had taken extraordinary measures to hide his true will, had trusted that his daughter would find it when the time came. She wrote that families who prey on dying relatives deserve no protection from the courts, that justice required looking past procedural technicalities to the underlying truth. I read the ruling twice, 3 times, trying to absorb what it meant. We'd won. Not the final victory, not yet, but the crucial battle that would determine everything that came after. Patricia would appeal, would fight on, but she was fighting from a position of weakness now, defending against criminal charges, watching her empire crumble. My mother cried, quiet tears of relief and exhaustion. Jennifer smiled, said this was why she'd become a lawyer, for moments like this when the system worked the way it was supposed to. We left Portland and drove back to Kennebunkport, watching the sun set over the ocean, turning the water gold and orange. My mother said she wanted to visit my father's grave, wanted to tell him that his daughter had won, that his final act of courage had mattered. We drove to the cemetery in Boston, walked through rows of marble headstones until we found his. Thomas Richard Bennett, the stone read, "Beloved husband and father." The words felt like lies, but they were the lies he'd lived with, the comfortable fictions that had made life bearable. My mother knelt beside the grave, placed her hand on the cold stone. She said she'd forgiven him years ago, that she understood weakness, that she knew how easy it was to make one bad choice and then spend a lifetime trying to justify it. She said she hoped he'd found peace, hoped he knew his daughter had become someone good despite everything, hoped he understood that love sometimes meant sacrifice, even when that sacrifice looked like abandonment. I stood behind her, watching her say goodbye to a man she'd loved and lost long before he died. That night the news broke. Patricia Bennett arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The headlines were everywhere. The woman who'd been painted as a grieving widow now shown in a mugshot, her perfect composure finally cracked. Marcus and Lauren were implicated too, their names appearing in the charging documents, their assets frozen, their reputations destroyed. The empire Patricia had built was collapsing, and everyone who'd helped her was going down with her. The trial took another 8 months. Patricia's lawyers fought desperately. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Marcus got 12. Lauren got 8. The judge said they betrayed not just their family, but the basic social contract that said you don't steal from the dying, don't manipulate the vulnerable, don't destroy evidence to cover your crimes. When it was over, when the appeals had been exhausted and the sentences were final, I inherited everything. The houses, the company, the investments, $340 million that felt more like a burden than a blessing. I sold Bennett Maritime Holdings to a competitor, donated half the proceeds to ocean conservation efforts, kept enough to be secure but not enough to lose myself. I bought my mother a new house in Kennebunkport, bigger than her cottage, with a garden she could tend and windows facing the sea. Kept the lighthouse, the place where my father had hidden the truth, and turned it into a retreat for people escaping domestic violence, a place where they could be safe while they rebuilt their lives. The Beacon Hill mansion I sold immediately, couldn't stand to set foot in it again. The Newport House became a marine research station, hosting scientists studying climate change and coastal erosion. The art collection, the cars, the jewelry, all of it was liquidated, turned into money that could do something useful instead of just sitting in glass cases gathering dust. I kept almost nothing, just a few photographs of my father before Patricia, a few letters he'd written to my mother when they were young and hopeful, proof that once, a long time ago, he'd been capable of love that wasn't transactional. My mother and I see each other weekly, sometimes more. We cook together, walk on the beach, talk about everything and nothing. We're still learning each other, still building something that was interrupted before it could fully form. It's not the relationship we would have had if she'd never left, but it's real and it's ours and it's enough. She tells me about her childhood on the farm, about her parents who worked until their hands bled, about the values she learned from dirt and animals and seasons that couldn't be rushed. I tell her about my work, about coral reefs dying and kelp forests disappearing, about trying to document what we're losing before it's gone forever. Sometimes we talk about my father, about the man he was and the man he became, about how fear can turn you into someone you don't recognize. My mother says he was good once, genuinely good, before ambition convinced him that winning mattered more than being decent. She says his biggest mistake wasn't marrying Patricia, wasn't even sending her away, but not fighting when it mattered, not standing up when he still had the power to make a difference. She says cowardice compounds, that each time you choose comfort over courage, it gets easier to keep choosing wrong, until one day you wake up and don't recognize the person in the mirror. I think about that a lot, about the choices we make and the people we become. My father tried to buy redemption with a hidden will, tried to fix in death what he'd broken in life. It wasn't enough, couldn't be enough, but it was something. It gave me back my mother, gave me the resources to do meaningful work, gave me a chance to build something good from the wreckage of his mistakes. Maybe that's all forgiveness is, not excusing what was done, but refusing to let it define what comes next. I still work as a marine biologist, still spend months at sea studying ecosystems most people never see. But now I fund my own research, build my own teams, answer to no one but the questions I'm trying to solve. I've published papers on coral restoration, on kelp forest recovery, on resilience in systems that have been damaged but not destroyed. My colleagues don't know about the inheritance, about the trial, about the family that imploded over money and lies. To them, I'm just another researcher. Someone who cares about salt water and sunlight, and the stubborn persistence of life in harsh conditions. My mother sometimes asks if I'm happy, if the fighting was worth it, if having the inheritance has made my life better. I tell her I don't know about happy, but I'm purposeful, I'm building something that matters, I'm using resources that almost destroyed my family to try to protect things that can't protect themselves. I tell her the money is just a tool, that it has no inherent meaning, that what matters is what you build with it, what you choose to value, who you become in the process of deciding what's worth fighting for. She understands. She spent 35 years with almost nothing, built a life from fragments, found meaning in the small acts of helping others learn to read, of tending a garden, of watching the ocean change with the seasons. She says wealth is dangerous because it makes you think you're special, makes you forget that everyone is just trying to survive with whatever tools they've been given. She says the real inheritance my father left me wasn't money. It was the lesson of what happens when you forget that, when you start believing your comfort matters more than someone else's suffering. On the anniversary of my father's death, my mother and I returned to his grave. We don't bring flowers, don't perform grief we don't feel. We just stand there in the cold Boston morning, acknowledging that he existed, that he mattered, that he failed in ways that hurt people but also succeeded in ways that saved them. We tell him about the foundation, about the lighthouse, about the research station in Newport. We tell him his money is being used to protect things instead of exploiting them, to create opportunities instead of hoarding them, to lift people up instead of pushing them down. I don't know if he can hear us. Don't know if anything persists beyond the silence of death. But standing there with my mother, feeling the wind that comes off the harbor, smelling the salt and decay and stubborn life of the coast, I feel something like peace. Not forgiveness exactly, but an acceptance that people are complicated, that they contain multitudes of good and bad, courage and cowardice, love and fear. My father was all of those things, and so am I, and so is everyone trying to navigate the impossible task of being human. We leave the cemetery and drive back to Kennebunkport, past towns I've driven through 100 times, past coastline that's been here longer than any of us and will remain long after we're gone. My mother puts her hand on mine, the same hand that pushed me on swings when I was small, the same hand that packed a bag and left me sleeping so she could protect me from dangers I was too young to understand. I hold on tight, feeling the bones beneath papery skin, the strength that survived 35 years of exile, the love that never stopped even when everything else did. The lighthouse appears in the distance, white against blue sky, standing where it stood for a century, warning ships away from rocks, guiding them to safety. Inside, people are healing, rebuilding, learning to trust again after betrayal. My father's money made that possible, his final attempt to be the man he should have been all along. It's not enough to redeem him, not enough to erase the harm, but it's something. And sometimes something is all we get. Sometimes that has to be enough. 5 years have passed since the trial ended, and I'm standing on the deck of a research vessel anchored off the coast of Maine. The water is impossibly clear today, revealing kelp forests swaying 30 feet below like an underwater cathedral. My team is preparing for a dive to document recovery patterns in areas we've been restoring, planting new kelp, removing invasive species, giving the ecosystem a chance to remember what it used to be. This work moves slowly, requires patience most people don't have, demands faith that small actions compound into meaningful change. It's the opposite of everything my father built his empire on, the opposite of quick profits and quarterly returns and growth at any cost. My mother visits the research station in Newport twice a year, stays for a week each time, walks the beaches collecting shells and sea glass. She's 77 now, moving slower but still sharp, still capable of surprising me with observations about human nature that come from decades of watching from the margins. Last month she told me she's been writing a memoir. Not for publication but for herself, trying to make sense of the choices she made and the life that resulted. She asked if I wanted to read it when she's finished. I said yes, even though I'm not sure I'm ready to see my childhood through her eyes, to understand the full weight of what she carried while I grew up thinking she was dead. The lighthouse hosts 12 women right now, all of them escaping situations where staying would have meant losing themselves or worse. They arrive broken, terrified, convinced they have nowhere to go and no one who will believe them. The staff helps them file restraining orders, find lawyers, access resources they didn't know existed. Some stay for weeks, others for months, but they all leave stronger than they arrived, carrying tools they didn't have before, knowing that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. My father's money funds this, his wealth transformed into safety, his legacy rewritten one rescued life at a time. I think about legacy often, about what we leave behind when we're gone, about whether redemption is possible or if we're all just stumbling forward trying to do less harm than the generation before us. My father tried to fix everything with a hidden will, a dramatic gesture that cost him nothing because he was already dying. It worked in the sense that I got the inheritance and Patricia went to prison, but it didn't erase the decades of cowardice, didn't restore the years my mother and I lost, didn't undo the damage to everyone who'd been hurt by his choices. Some things can't be fixed, only acknowledged and mourned and eventually released. Patricia writes me letters from prison, or she did for the first 2 years until I asked her to stop. They were always the same, claiming she'd been trying to protect my father, claiming she'd loved him in her way, claiming I'd misunderstood everything. She never once apologized, never acknowledged the embezzling or the threats or the manipulation. Even behind bars, even with everything taken from her, she couldn't admit what she'd done. I don't hate her anymore, which surprises me. Hatred requires energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. Requires keeping her alive in my thoughts when I'd prefer she fade into irrelevance. She's serving her sentence, and that's enough. Justice doesn't require my continued attention. Marcus and Lauren I hear about occasionally through mutual acquaintances, both of them rebuilding lives on a much smaller scale, working ordinary jobs, living in ordinary neighborhoods, learning what it means to exist without the cushion of inherited wealth. I hope they've learned something, hope they've become better people, but I don't need to know either way. They made their choices, faced the consequences, and whatever comes next is between them and their own consciences. I've spent enough of my life defined by my father's family. I'm building my own now, choosing who belongs in it, creating something that reflects my values instead of inheriting someone else's mistakes. The ocean stretches out endlessly, dark blue fading to lighter blue at the horizon, clouds casting shadows that move across the surface like thoughts across a mind. I breathe salt air, feel wind that's traveled thousands of miles before reaching me, hear seabirds calling as they hunt for fish driven upward by the currents below. This is what matters to me now, this work of restoration and documentation, this patient attention to systems that don't care about human timelines or human drama. The kelp doesn't know about wills or trials or family betrayals. It just grows or doesn't grow, responds to light and nutrients and temperature, follows patterns that have sustained life for millions of years. My mother says I've found peace, and maybe she's right, though peace feels too simple a word for what I've built. It's more like purpose, like alignment between who I am and what I do, like finally understanding that the life I'm living is the one I chose instead of one that was chosen for me. My father's money made that possible, gave me freedom most people never have, and I'm grateful for it even while recognizing the cost at which it came. Gratitude and grief can coexist, I've learned. You can accept a gift while acknowledging the harm that made it possible. The dive team is ready, waving me over, eager to get underwater before the weather changes. I join them, checking equipment, running through safety protocols, preparing to descend into a world that's quieter than the one above. Down there, surrounded by kelp and fish and filtered sunlight, I feel closest to something I might call contentment, a sense that I'm doing work that matters, that the hours I spend here contribute to something larger than myself, that my father's legacy has been transformed into something he never imagined but might have approved of, if he'd been capable of imagining differently. We descend slowly, equalizing pressure, watching the surface recede above us. The kelp forest opens up below, vast and swaying, home to dozens of species that depend on this ecosystem for survival. We document growth patterns, measure stem lengths, photograph areas where restoration has taken hold and areas where it hasn't. The work is tedious, requires focus, demands attention to detail that leaves no room for dwelling on the past. This is what I've learned, that the best way to honor what was lost is to build something new, something that wouldn't exist without the loss but isn't defined by it either. When we surface an hour later, the sun has shifted, painting the water different shades of blue and green. My mother would love this, I think, would appreciate the patience this work requires, would recognize in it the same values her parents taught her on that Vermont farm a lifetime ago. Care for what you've been given, work with your hands, understand that some things can't be rushed, accept that growth happens slowly or not at all. These lessons survived her exile, survived my father's corruption, survived Patricia's attempts to destroy everything good that remained in our family. They're mine now, my inheritance, more valuable than any amount of money. Back on the boat, recording observations in waterproof notebooks, I think about the question my mother asked me years ago. Was the fighting worth it? Did the inheritance make my life better? Am I happy? The answer is complicated, layered, impossible to reduce to yes or no. The fighting was necessary, but brutal. The inheritance is useful but carries weight. And happiness feels like the wrong measurement for a life that's been marked by loss and recovery in equal measure. What I have instead is meaning, purpose, work that challenges me, relationships that sustain me, a sense that my existence contributes something positive to a world that desperately needs people to care about things other than themselves. The research vessel heads back to port as evening approaches, the lighthouse visible in the distance, its light beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Inside, women are making dinner together, sharing stories, learning to trust again. My mother is probably in her garden, harvesting the last vegetables before frost, storing them for winter, preparing for the season of dormancy that makes spring possible. And somewhere in a federal prison, Patricia is serving her sentence, learning what it means to have everything stripped away, To be reduced to just yourself with no wealth or status to hide behind. I don't wish her suffering, but I don't wish her redemption either. I just wish her irrelevant. A chapter that's closed. A person who no longer has the power to define my story. The harbor lights come into view, warm and welcoming, promising hot showers and warm food, and the comfortable exhaustion that comes from honest work. My team is laughing about something, sharing a joke I missed while I was lost in thought. I join their conversation, letting myself be pulled into the present, into the life I've built from the ruins of the one I inherited. This is enough, I think. This work, these people, this purpose. My father gave me money, but my mother gave me values, and it's the values that sustain me, that guide the choices I make about how to spend the money, that determine whether his final gesture becomes a blessing or a curse. We dock as full darkness settles, stars beginning to appear in a sky swept clear by ocean wind. I help secure the boat, carry equipment back to the lab, say goodnight to my team. Alone in my office, I pull out my phone and text my mother. Thinking about you, I write. Love you. Her response comes quickly, probably typed with one finger. Her concession to modern technology. Love you too, sweetheart. Come for dinner Sunday. Bring stories. I smile, promise I will, and turn off my phone. The research station is quiet now. Just me and the sound of water against rocks, the eternal conversation between land and sea. I think about my father one last time today, about the man he was and the man he wished he'd been, about the gap between those two versions and the damage that gap caused. I think about his letter, hidden in a lighthouse waiting for someone to find it, to understand that even cowards sometimes find courage at the end, that even the corrupt sometimes remember what it felt like to have principles. It wasn't enough to save him, but it was enough to save me, to give me a chance at a life he never had, to break the cycle of wealth destroying the people who possessed it. I lock the office and walk out into the night, toward my small apartment overlooking the harbor, toward rest and tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water, regular as a heartbeat, warning and welcoming, marking the boundary between safety and danger. My father built his empire on exploiting that boundary, on taking risks that enriched him while destroying others. I'm trying to do something different, to use what he left me to protect instead of exploit, to heal instead of harm, to prove that wealth doesn't have to corrupt if you refuse to let it define your worth. Whether I'm succeeding is a question I can't answer, one that will only be clear from a distance I won't live to see. But I'm trying, showing up each day, doing the work, making choices that feel aligned with something deeper than profit or power, or the accumulation of things I don't need. That's all any of us can do, really. Try to be better than the generation before us, try to do less harm, try to leave behind something that might help someone else survive their own impossible circumstances. My father tried in his broken, inadequate way. My mother tried, sacrificing everything she loved to keep me safe. Now it's my turn to try, to take what they gave me and transform it into something neither of them could have imagined but both would have recognized as good. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.